What were you asking again, Lexi?
So, a lot of our listeners are familiar with astral projection during meditation or dreaming, astral projection in a light body. And so, since we have you here, David, I wanted to ask if you could sort of explain the difference between remote viewing and astral projection.
Sure. Astral projection was really the focal point and the in-state objective that came out of the Monroe Institute. And there are lots of other books that were written about it. You know, Monroe was about putting people into an induced theta wave state using hemispherical synchronization, which actually was hemisync was not something Robert Monroe created. They may have trademarked the term hemisync, but hemisync was actually discovered. Binaural beat was discovered, and the effects of binaural beat was discovered by a physicist in I think Belgium. Don't quote me on that part, but a physicist in Europe in and it was discovered there. He was using big wax cones on stands, and the subject would sit, and the cones would go into the ears, and then assistants would have different tuning forks, and they would hit the tuning forks and simultaneously feed those into the cones, and then they would capture the verbal feedback of the individual experiencing that, like what was happening to them. And so that's actually where the effect of binaural beat in creating a hemispherical synchronization in the brain. So it's kind of, you can think of it as an induced theta brainwave state as instead of a learned theta brainwave state or a learned alpha brainwave state. And the formulation for it is pretty clear. You have to have this frequency, and that frequency produces this frequency. So it's an A and a B and a C that creates the C. Now, that's what Robert Monroe was all about. I think he was a radio show host, or he was a radio technician, a radio engineer. And when he formed in Faber, Virginia, the Monroe Institute, his intention there was to induce these, using binaural beat, to induce these brainwave states, and then also in them to have a guided meditation, kind of walking you through a cool down process in an isolation chamber, which were nothing sophisticated, nothing like you've seen in the movies, but people with headphones on, stereo headphones, and then doing that. And the idea was to induce an out-of-body experience. That was his objective for it. So there, as I said, there have been lots of people write about them, lots of books. I have on it. I think I experienced that maybe 3 or 4 times, and I did it 2 times in the unit and then 2 other times outside the unit, which kind of led me to get to the unit. But my point is that it is not, it's not remote viewing. It's really kind of experiential. Despite what many people will say, it's extraordinarily difficult to induce it at will. It's impossible to control the astral body, whatever that is. It is, you can't use it as an intelligence collection tool. Hence, the CIA and the DIA never once sent people to Monroe Institute to bring them back as remote viewers. In fact, despite the fact that at the Monroe Institute, Joe McMoneagle married Robert Monroe's daughter. And so Joe McMoneagle then became, secondary big man on campus with his wife and her father. When her father passed away, then Joe and his friend Skip Atwater from the remote viewing unit as well ended up being the guys that were now responsible to try to keep, the Monroe Institute going, along with his wife, Robert Monroe's daughter. So I understand that, they were really pushing and trying to get the CIA and the DIA to contract with them to send people to the Monroe Institute over and over and over again as part of their preparatory training before they went to remote viewing. But the CIA was non-committal. I mean, the DIA was non-committal about it. They wrote a very neutral document. Some people interpreted it as a very positive document. It was a positive document, but neutral in terms of saying, yeah, this is something we need to do. And then the CIA simply stepped in and went, no application. They have no security clearance. We're not sending people to that. No. And so it went. Remote viewing, by contrast to that, particularly in coordinate remote viewing, it's a procedural dogma. It has a protocol-driven dogma. It again calls on you to go from gamma, beta. We're talking probably in gamma right now, especially the more coffee I drink. But, eventually as the day wears on, you kind of slide into beta. And when you are going to do coordinate remote viewing, the training is to take you to an alpha brainwave state. And in that alpha brainwave state where you are still consciously aware of what's around you, because the whole metronomic cadence of the structure is to detect, decode, and objectify. Detect, decode, objectify. Detect what? Detect waveform expressions of information that are decoded by your biological brain utilizing its experience Rolodex. And then that is objectified in 2 dimensions. So you go from 6-dimensional or 8-dimensional hyperspace, from 8-dimensional hyperspace, which is theoretical, but there's a lot written on it. Don't ask me to explain it because it's 2 hours to get past like the first paragraph. So 8-dimensional hyperspace, people can read about that if they're interested. Consider it the holographic matrix field. Okay.
Right.
Consider it the universe beyond the universe, those kinds of things. It is a place where energy is everything and everything is energy. And therefore everything can be expressed as waveform and is waveform on some level. Because very briefly, it goes into this whole idea of like particle wave theory to illustrate this for you. When in quantum physics, when you're talking about particle wave theory, it goes something like this in very lay terms, okay? When we take a waveform, and we want to observe the particle, what that means is measure the particle. So like on an oscilloscope, when that particle is, or when that waveform is now observed, you'll see a spike in the oscilloscope, and that's called a coalescence of the waveform comes up into a position. So we now call that a particle, position 1. And then when it is no longer measured or no longer observed, it means that it then decoheres back into waveform. And then when you observe it again, it coalesces back up into a point. You can call that position 2, right? If you stop, it goes decoheres, then coalesces the next time you measure it. And so now you have 3 positions, right, in this example. And the questions asked, like in Newtonian physics, it is, so how does the waveform, or how does the particle get from this position to this position to this position? Well, the explanation there would be, well, it travels by the most direct route. So in other words, the waveform is linear. Well, in quantum mechanical physics, it is understood that the waveform is not linear at all. In fact, the way that waveform gets from position 1 to 2 to 3 is that, and this is what you have to hear, by every possible path, every possible path. That means that it is omnipresent. That waveform is omnipresent, right? Omnidirectional, omnipresent. And if you have an ability using this supercomputer to detect and decode that waveform, that means that you too are at the quantum level, you are omnipresent. And it also means that you are omnipotent and omniscient. Starts with omniscience. It means you have access to all information everywhere without end. Okay. Call it a cosmic library. It's probably what they're referring to in the Akashic record or in the collective unconscious or a holographic matrix field. So if you then have access to all of that, will you understand it all? Probably not, because you can really only comprehend things that are within your frame of reference, right? Based on your experience. It doesn't mean, though, that you contribute to or learn from or pull from, right? Concepts that are out there that have never, ever been thought of or considered before. So that when you are then you have access to that, and you are omnipresent, and you are omniscient, well, then you can be called omnipotent, in my opinion. It's fair to say that because now you're powerful. You are all powerful by that definition. And I want to be really careful because I want to point this out. A lot of people think that those words, omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresence, are only applied in scripture to God. And that's not true. Those were actually derivatives of ancient Greek language that became ancient Latin language. And those words were used to describe humankind, right? They were our potentials long before they existed, long before the King James Version of the Bible was ever written. So, I mean, hundreds of years before the King James Version of the Bible was ever written. So they were used even before, first drafts of the Old Testament were pulled together. So they did not necessarily apply to deity, something you must accept on a basis of faith. They, in fact, were being used to describe certain attributes or capabilities of man, of humankind. Sorry, ladies. You know what I mean when I say that. But that is where that came from. And it's a big disputed. There are people that just take a huge opposition to that. But that is, in fact, the truth. That's where those things came from. And then somebody stole those from us, ripped them from our descriptors, adjectives for us, and then applied them to something that you have to accept on a basis of faith, sight unseen, the great big test of what it is to live in this life. I take great comfort in knowing that, that every human being born into this existence has been gifted with these abilities. Every human being. It is not unique to any single one person at all. It does not matter if you've been frocked or not. It just, every human being has that ability, and you should just revel in that. But what you should also do is ask yourself, if we were gifted with that ability to tap into that, to not only believe that there was something beyond the physical, but to know that there was something beyond the physical, and to know that we have access to it, can learn from it, contribute to it, that we are part of it, and we have never not been part of it. And ask yourself then, why? Why would a creator, and I have to say it has to be a creator, I don't care about what you call it, I just know we did not, originate in primordial ooze. So, I mean, nobody's been successful in producing not even a single cell organism out of primordial ooze. You want to know why? Because they don't have the ability to create primordial ooze that is not contaminated in some way by what's already here. So if you're doing it with something that's already here, it's not sterile elemental, then what happens is, things can come together, because now you can't actually ever replicate the test. You understand? Because you don't have the raw materials with which to do that. So I like that fact that I understand that, under the right conditions, using, a created ooze, that they can form a single cell amoeba in some way or some other kind of life.
Sure.
But that the experiment's flawed. Materials are flawed.
Right.
So anyway, that was a long, weird answer to remote viewing and astral projection.
Actually, it's fascinating. So you're basically sort of saying is that it's not just that it's outside of us, it's that it is part of us as omnipresent, omniscient. All of those elements are actually incorporated as part of our particle waveform in the human context.
Right. It's an ability. It's who we are. I mean, we have access to these waveform expressions. We have the ability to detect, decode, and objectify them. And the great question, I think, is, what happens when we die? I think the great question is, if a creator bestowed these gifts upon you, then what the hell are you doing with them? What are you doing? Why would we, all of us, every man and woman and child, have been given this? And if that's the case, have we abused, misused, or been totally and completely ignorant of it because We've surrendered to pseudo-academic interpretation and downplay of it, or pseudo-spiritual, or pseudo-religious, or pseudo-political, pseudo-whatever, that has just destroyed the ability and damned it down in many cases. But if you were several hundred years ago, if you were to bring that up, they would have tied you to a tree and burned you, or thrown you in the river with rocks tied around you or something. It's just ridiculous that we have done that. And we've just abused this fantastic gift, or ignored it, which is even worse. Just to have ignored it and said it doesn't exist. I have to wait till I die and then I can figure this out. Right?
Well, now you've said it,
funny,
so
right?
we're not ignoring it. So we won't be ignoring it. People will be listening. I'm curious, David, when you were in astral projection, and as you were saying, the CIA wasn't interested in it because it cannot be controlled. It's not a space. It's not a dimension where things can be controlled. Remote viewing is very different, as you said. It's very protocol related.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right.
So did you feel danger when you were in the astral projection space?
No, I just felt like, as far as I was concerned, it was like a short-term amusement ride. It didn't serve any purpose. And, it was, I had some weird experiences with it. I mean, once, at the remote viewing unit, I was doing an extended remote viewing, which is what probably facilitated it.
Oh, interesting.
Well, you're in extended remote viewing, you're operating in a theta brainwave state, and you can often drop into delta. So you can go delta and you porpoise back up to theta and drop back down into delta. You can, kind of what they call porpoising in the brain waves. And when you're doing something like that, and if you kind of lose your focus, which is why we started using what are called focus questions, if you lose focus and you lose your intention, then other things can happen. And it's, again, not something that's driven by an intention to have the out-of-body experience. It just kind of happens. And when it happens, it's not, look, we're using a term out-of-body experience and we're acting as though there's actually an energy separation outside of the physical body. That is not. That's not it. Because if we go back to what we just talked about in the quantum physics interpretation of who we are and what we are, then it's not that at all. It's just it's a repackaging of the waveform interpretation so that we feel like, we've separated. And it takes on very bizarre characteristics. I mean, I can remember being in the extended remote viewing room, which is like a bed, and they would have a desk with a lamp and it had a red light bulb in it. Yeah, it was like a house of ill repute. It was quite bizarre. And you would lay there with your, you had a pillow and a blanket and you had headphones on and you're going through the cool down process. And when you're learning it, there's a monitor there. Mine was Fern Gavin.
Mm-hmm.
But when you are operational and then you're solo, you don't use monitors. I just went over one time and I kind of lost what I was working on and lost about what my focus and my intention was. And the next thing I remember is getting up off the bed and the whole plate, I went over and opened up the door to the extended remote viewing room and the hallway was dark. The whole building where the remote viewing took place, the recording machines and stuff it's all dark. I was like, well, that's very weird, that it's all dark like that. It's got to be in the middle of the day because I know that my target time was like, so now it's like, did I fall asleep and everybody went home and, turned the lights out and I've just been here or something? You're asking yourself all these questions. I walked down the hall and I remember that I opened the front door to the RV building and I looked out, there was a parking lot that was only about 50 feet across at the most that went. And then there was the headquarters building, where everybody's cubicles and offices were over there. And I can just remember it was like an eclipse of the sun. And I just walked out in the middle of the parking lot. And for some reason, I just started rising up while I was in the parking lot. I was rising up with my back toward the earth. And I went up very far in the air, maybe 1,000 feet. And then I started to fall backwards to come back coming back down again. I was not in control of any of this, right?
Right.
It just was like, you're up. Yeah. Oh, this is very weird. And then you're up, and then you feel yourself descending. And all of a sudden, then I wake up, and I'm in the ERV room, and and the lights aren't off anymore, except for in that place. But yeah, so that was my
so interesting,
probably last experience with it. Fun.
Does that answer
interesting
your question?
to talk about.
It is. It's really interesting to talk about. Lexi, does that kind of answer your question? Because I know there's a lot of discussion in our community about astral projection.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I know there's people who are very nervous for me. They've seen the Insidious movies where, you're astral projecting and there's malevolent spirits and things like that. With the group that I meditate with, we do have a leader. We kind of have like a teacher, not a leader. That sounds crazy, but we have a moderator who leads us through the meditation. And some of the more intense meditation, like in Hermeticism, it's the ceremonial path working. We're going to specific places. There's a specific plan. You're not supposed to fall asleep. Still, weird things can happen. So I don't do that on my own. I don't do that for a job. I only do that for a couple hours each week because it is scary. I've had a lot of scary dreams in the astral, but not while waking. But word of caution is always important. I think, David, it's amazing that you're not scared, because I'm scared of some things I've seen in the astral.
You can have such encounters, you can have that in extended remote viewing. It's extraordinarily rare in CRV. In fact, almost non-existent that I'm aware of, unless you go looking for it. But in extended remote viewing, which is a different protocol, not nearly so rules driven as is CRV. So in ERV, one of the things that I always caution students is that that's why we have them shield themselves with their intention when they go out there, because you have to accept the fact that for whatever benevolence is out there, there is equal malevolence. There's a balance within the universe, within the dimension. It's not all one-sided good folk and just a few bad. There are positive and negatives in all things out there. And you have to understand that. And so if you go looking for negative, you'll find it. If you go out there with the intention of, just seeing what I can dabble in, okay, then expect you'll bring that upon yourself. The thing I say to students is you have to grasp this reality, which is nothing out there has power over you. Nothing. There's nothing there more significant or more powerful than you, but they are wiser than you in that many of those, negative entities have had millennia to practice their craft. So if you want to step in, to that realm and you want to toy with malevolence, then be prepared to have things probably not go your way, because the idea there is to find your, exaggerated, exacerbated. And if you're afraid of something, then they know what that is already, and they will make you afraid of that in the best way they possibly can. They're not there to be your friend. They are there to do whatever they're doing. For Pete's sake, I have no idea. I just know that it's there. So that's what I always want students to not understand, is that also when you're out there, if you invite it, okay, then you have to deal with it. But you have no right and you have no responsibility to bring any of that back with you.
Right.
So
exactly.
Leave it right where you found it and come back and learn your lesson. Don't go out there with the intention of, well, gee, maybe I can, see something that's a little freaky today. Because, yeah, I'm sure it'll be there for you if you do that. I'm sure there's plenty of dark things out there that would just love to stand in line to come over and screw with you on something like that. So don't do it. So I'm not,
fascinating
I tell people to stop being a channeler, people,
interesting.
Don't channel, because a channel, I didn't actually know the difference between channeling and transmedium or trance medium work. And where I learned it was I actually spent some time with J.C. Knight teaching the Ramtha followers up in Yelm, Washington. It was actually the single biggest class that I ever taught. It was it 3,600 students for a week-long
Wow.
CRB class. It was quite
Fun.
bizarre. Yeah,
Huh.
it was bizarre. But I had dinner with her every night in her mansion there, and
Uh-huh.
I was with a bunch of New Jersey cops that I had brought, not for any other reason than for them to, not because I needed guards or anything like that.
Right.
They were just friends, and I brought them there because they were trained by me in RV, so they wanted to come and help. I mean, I didn't have anybody
Mhm.
else to ask. So,
Mhm.
so there we were, and they were just hilarious because you can only picture like 6'3", 6'6", big heavy set New Jersey cops with big, thick, heavy New Jersey Hungarian accents,
Mhm.
in
Right.
this group. And I sat to her left the whole time we were there, and she was, asking me about the unit. And I said, and then there were these two girls that were channelers. And she goes, "Oh, channelers. Well, what did they do?" And then I described what they did. And she goes, "That's not channeling." She goes, "It's not channeling. What they were doing was transmedium work." So transmedium simply means that you are straddling one foot in the physical and one foot in the non-physical. And
Mhm.
as ridiculous as this may sound, it was to me ridiculous. Fern Gavin would sit there and ask an intelligence collection question to Angela, who would then ask her guide. She had two, George and Maurice. She would ask George or Maurice or both the question. And I just remember, and then they would get an answer, and they would give her the answer, and she would then pass it back to him. That's transmedia, right? I'm just
Mhm.
passing traffic one way and the other. And then the other was transmedium, where they would go into an altered state of consciousness, which is not
Right.
what these girls did. And the entity would not possess, but could speak through them, right?
Through them.
That kind of
Right.
an idea. Now, Jay-Z said that channeling is surrendering yourself to the entity, which I thought to myself, not a good idea, because how do you know if you consider it to be a reality, whether you do or you don't? And I know many people question it, but whether or not Ramtha is what, the 35,000-year-old entity and change now, since she's been doing it a long time, whether or not that is immaterial to the equation of the discussion here. It is, if you are willing to surrender yourself to whatever is going to step in to talk through you, right? Then I think you're dabbling in a realm and dabbling with things that you have no idea what the potential risks for it are. And, I have a tendency to believe that possession, at least on some level, is a very real thing. And I think that it's stupid if you set yourself up to do that. I just think you should think twice about that. And I mean, I told Jay-Z that, but it was her business, right? That was her business of
Interesting.
doing that. So
It's very, very interesting conversation. Wow. So I'm curious, David, as we're talking about multidimensional existence, and this interview was sort of set up to talk about space and
space.
aliens and all of the sightings that are being seen sort of like on a daily basis now worldwide. So it feels like, I actually feel like, well, that sounds boring compared to what we're actually talking about, but
Not to
to
me.
answer people, yeah. Well, okay, so let's talk about that.
The
What's
ground
piercing
we
the
just
universe
covered,
at the uh-huh.
the ground we just covered, I'm happy to cover it for you young ladies, but typically I just don't even go there anymore. It's like not my cup of tea. I mean, I know
Right.
what I know about it. I'm certainly by no means an expert in any of it. I've trained a whole lot of mediums in remote viewing, and they all have, none of them that I know of have stepped out of their mediumship work to go do just remote viewing. I think what they used it for was validation and verification of the work that they were capable of doing from a scientific, right, process that is not anecdotal. It is very much scientifically measured and evaluated against known quantifiable attributes. And that's how we do it in coordinate remote viewing, right? It is very much that way. And it'll never change, at least not in the way I teach it, because that's the whole point that allows you to stop believing that there's something more than the physical and have that transformative, aha, I now know that there is, because that's what changes how you walk through the rest of your life, is when you stop believing, which is very easy to do. We all believe something.
Mm-hmm.
But when you stop believing and you know, that changes your life. At least it did for me. And I believe that it has for all the students that I've trained over the decades. So
let's talk about space and aliens.
Yeah.
So let's talk about what your clearances are with, first of all, with regard to the space wars and space history in the United States, because I want our listeners to understand your background in it.
Well, contrary to popular belief, there's only top secret. It's as high as it goes. Then you get different qualifiers that go in that, depending upon what special access program, or which particular area that you're operating in. So there are different, add-ons to that, but there is nothing higher than top secret. So if you have a top secret special background investigation, which anybody that has a top secret gets, that's as high as it goes. So all the other things that people stand up and try to say about clearances and that kind of thing, you need to understand that. You walk into the Army as an officer and you have a secret background. You have a secret clearance. And then when you go into some top secret special access program, like I did, I was in 3 of them. Then what they do is they get you you're given a top secret. And a top secret requires, it's pretty weird. They send people out to your hometown to ask neighbors, like go over and ask a neighbor, like, he grew up here going to high school, right? Well, what kind of kid was he? Oh, I was not a good kid. I was So they have all this dirt on you that they just pull in, and they have to make a judgment call. And I think it's a guy, it's U.S. Marshals, I think, do that.
Oh, interesting.
And because I went into Royal Cape first, they actually had some way they expedited it. They expedite it, like it literally only took like 2 weeks to get it, which normally it's like 6 months to get it. But in Royal Cape, you had to have a TS to work there. So they did it quick. And they do still go and ask people, like wherever you live. At the time I lived in Maryland in Bowie, and they actually sent people. Oh no, I was at Fort Belvoir. So they sent people around, and then they sent people down to the Ranger Regiment, the 1st Ranger Battalion where I came from. And they'd talk to neighbors on either side of the house that you lived in. It was funny, but I got my clearance, I guess. So there's probably a lot of them that regret that now. So that's the clearance that I have. But then I worked in 3 of probably the most classified and controversial organizations, special access programs that the Army or the CIA or DIA had together. So Royal Cape was the first one, which was called the Activity, right? ISA. There's a book called Killer Elite, if anybody wants to read that. It's a good book. I have no idea how this guy got all the information he got. Somebody really spilled the beans for an organization where your efficiency reports that I got from there are still classified. So,
oh, cool.
And then, but he wrote this book, Killer Elite, and it's like everything about the unit during the time that I was there and before. And it was fairly new when I got there because it came into being when the Iranian hostage crisis occurred. And so the purpose of the place is to, support covert and clandestine military operations in tier 1 and tier 2 countries. And so it was a pretty cool place to be. And I ended up, based on my position, briefing John O. Marsh Jr., the Secretary of the Army, about 3-4 times a week on the movements of individuals within this organization. From there, I was recruited into the remote viewing unit, which I stayed there for 3 years. And then when I rotated out of there, because I had no intention of staying in that place longer than that, where some of them were there 15 years. I mean, that's
Right.
3/4 of a military career, and they were there. Yeah, I just can't even imagine that. I couldn't imagine it. So I only wanted my 3 years, and I probably would have left sooner if I could have, if I found some place to go. But then I
Right.
was recruited into Torn Image, which is a top secret special access program that dealt with strategic deception. And I was brought in
Mm.
there because I had a
Right.
special operations background, and they wanted me to be the counter narcotics deception officer. They wanted me to design
Remember
a
that.
deception that would theoretically bring about an intra-cartel war,
Hmm.
breaking up, the cash flow of the cartels and the human flow within the cartels. So I did that. And then from there, the rest is just kind of history about what's happened. But in terms of, clearances beyond those things, no. The things that I know about the space wars and about the space race, the only thing that is not available if you're willing to just be a researcher and a student and look to understand the history of it and the purposes of these things, because there's ample written about it, just not written in such a way that the public actually looks for it and knows anything about it. I mean, the public doesn't typically go read Air Force pamphlets that were written, back in 1949 and read those to understand what was going on then, but it's there if you want to look for it. So I had one occasion when I was the director of medical test and evaluation for the National Center for Medical Readiness, just outside Wright-Patterson. And when I served in that capacity there, my very good friend was Colonel Doug Hodge, who, he brought me on the Air Force Base often because he was a deputy director of a big, significant program there. And we went to see the classified museum there. So you don't normally get to go into the classified museum, especially if you're a civilian like me, because you don't have a clearance at that point, right? Once you're not serving in those capacities, but he did. And so, all he has to do is flip his ID and stuff and drag me on in there. I don't think they were really concerned that much about it anyway, but still, it was classified. So that was a place where I started to see some things that I was like, holy shit. Sorry. I didn't know
no,
this stuff
please.
existed. Oh, I can swear like that.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
please.
It was like,
we
holy
encourage
shit.
it.
I had no idea this stuff was there. It was like, I'm looking at an unmanned CIA photo drone that flew in the 1950s, like 53, 54, 55. So think on that now. This is in the early 50s. We had unmanned aerial photo reconnaissance drones flying over the Soviet Union and China. And who knew that? I didn't know that. Drones, I thought we first started getting drones when the first Predator came out. Seriously. I mean, that was back in the 90s when that stuff came out, before you had Reapers and Predators and Global Hawk and all that kind of stuff. I had no idea. I know that that's how Joseph Kennedy, the bigger, handsome one that was being steered to be the president of the United States by his father, Joe, he died in World War II. And how he died was he was piloting it was one of the two long-range bombers that we had during the war. And like the Flying Fortress or the other one that came in later, the Avenger or something like that. And he was flying that, and it was loaded with TNT. And it had an onboard flyby signal, box that they were capable of doing, but they couldn't take the aircraft off or land it. And what they were trying to do was make it a flying bomb, and they were going to use it to go bomb these dams and places in Norway where they knew that the Nazis were working on developing heavy water in their race or attempt to try to build a nuclear weapon, practically before we were, and at the same time we were. So we were trying to take out those kinds of things, destroy the water sources and things by killing these big dams. And so what he did was, they had a tendency to cause shortages in this stuff, meaning like the wires would spark
Right.
and short out. And they knew about it, but he was still courageous enough to fly it off the ground. And then to get it, he was supposed to get it to altitude and then kind of turn on this autopilot. Then the guys in the plane behind following, right, could fly this thing. One pilot flying that plane, the other pilot flying the plane that he was in, and he parachuted out, and then they pick him up later. But he couldn't.
I see.
They couldn't take it off on their own. They couldn't apply power and pull back on the yoke and get it up and trim it up and that stuff. The pilot had to do that, and then unask the airplane. And
Right.
it was in the process of doing that, and he had already pointed it out that this thing had shorted out before, and it shorted out and ignited the TNT and blew him up in the aircraft in the air. He was the only one on board the aircraft, but that's how he died.
It's fascinating.
To me, it sounds like, I don't know. This is just my professional opinion with my
I eagerly await this.
my 0 level clearance, and we'll just take that one with a grain of salt. I sort of think, time travelers, right? How could this exist in the 1950s? I just love the idea of the time traveler who comes back with technology. Otherwise, why would they have it? Or sort of like, like on the X-Files, the Men in Black, this sort of idea of shadow men or watchers, I guess they're called. I think you've even talked about watchers before, maybe, David.
Well, no, the first book, I hate the term psychic warrior, the title for that book. I really just
great
loathe
title.
that.
I love it so much.
I know St. Martin's thought so. I just cringed when they said that. I was like, because I have never claimed that I had any kind of precognitive, condition or capability, or I never even would think of using the term psychic for anything that I was or did or anything else. So I really cringed at it. But I called the book when it was first submitted to the publisher, Comes the Watcher, which I liked, Comes the Watcher. And then they turned it into this. Yeah, they turned it into the other thing. But
great title for a movie.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is a movie called The Watcher. Isn't it a comic book character or something?
Yeah,
or some graphic novel
Come the
character?
Watcher.
Yeah, Comes the Watcher.
It's more ominous.
Yeah. Yeah, I thought so. I was kind of feeling ominous in those days. So I needed something to release that. But I hear what you're saying, and I'm sure that there was something to do with some of that. I don't think anybody who is a creative designer comes up with these things necessarily on a drafting board. It's like he was not a student of mine, but he was an acquaintance of mine. Reeves Callaway designs Callaway Corvettes, race cars, and he's also a guy, if you go spend some, I guess $250,000 on the most expensive Corvette, you give him that Corvette and another $250,000 and he turns it into a Callaway Corvette, which is significant. And people who are Callaway Corvette owners are very proud of their Corvettes. Reeves and I, he was one of my first remote viewing students in Manhattan. I had this class that I taught there with Emily Squires, who was one of the directors of Sesame Street. She was a student. Her husband, Lynn Belzer, who ran a comedy show on radio in Manhattan. Reeves and a bunch of other people, and I apologize if they ever hear this, that I can't remember their names. It was all kind of a haze back then. But just with being with Reeves, he grew up in Southern California, and I was out there, and he calls me up and he says, "Hey, I'm going to come to San Diego. We got a Callaway Corvette show there. Want to come?" So I was like, "Hell yeah," So get to go hang out with Reeves and get to go see all these expensive cars and drool while I'm walking around. And so, yeah, I did that. And he goes, "Hey, my dad read your book, and he'd like to meet you." So this is Eli Callaway, right? Married 8 times. Guys, he was a trip. I mean, he's like probably 20 years older than me now. And he is on his 8th wife. And he had this really funny explanation for it. Like, I don't think people are meant to stay together for more than, he had a time limit on it. It was like, okay, interesting concept. But his
Jeez.
whole idea was, he goes, look, I read the book. He goes, I'm fascinated by it. I don't want you to teach me remote viewing. I don't want to learn that. He goes, I just wanted to understand what your take on this is. He goes, I don't design things sitting at a drafting table. Where do you design it? It comes to me in a vision. It comes to me while I'm dreaming, or it comes to me when I'm napping. It comes to me at these really, when I'm outside the place of where I have, judgment or self-doubt or self-criticism, where something just comes and I just capture it as best I can. And I don't even know what the materials are in it. And he goes, and then my engineering and my engineering team, we get together and look at this and decide how to make this manifest in the physical. That was a fascinating, but very understandable concept, right? And so months later, maybe years, I am asked to come out to the Life Sciences Foundation in Minneapolis, St. Paul. And Buck, who owns I don't think he's got 39 patents, maybe still viable today, of things that he's designed, hydraulic systems and engines and different kinds of motors, like the rotary motor. He says essentially the same thing. Read your book. Don't want you to teach me remote viewing, but I just want to bounce this off you. He goes, everything that I've ever designed, he said, it started coming to me as a very young man when I was in my 20s. He goes, I would wake up in the early morning hours and there would be this vision in my head of something. And he goes, I would just roll over and write it on the white tablecloth covering that was on the nightstand. He goes, until my wife really got upset about me doing that, right? Because he would roll over with an ink pen and write on this white cloth. You can only imagine how most wives would get really upset about a guy doing that. So he started learning that he could keep paper there and a pen there. And when he rolled over, he could just sketch it right away. Because it was like most things, it's fleeting, right? It comes to you and it's there, but it may not stick. So you want to objectify it. That's what the objectification is. That takes it out of the conceptual illusion of your mind, because your mind spins faster than a superconductor. I mean, a supercomputer. That's human thought, human cognition. It has a neural clock speed faster than a supercomputer's neural clock speed. There are all sorts of things written extensively, difficult for you to read unless you understand the physics of it, but just talking about the fact that the human mind cognates faster than the speed of light, which would explain why taking the neural clock speed of a human being and translating that into how they clock speed a particular computer and back forth, they found a language where they could measure objectively the clock speeds between the two, and humans win. We're faster.
We still win.
We are faster. Yeah, we're faster. And ultimately, at least when most of the studies were done, we also have the capacity to store as much or more than most supercomputers have. So
wow.
This whole, if you ever hear somebody tell you that you only use 10% of your brain, just dismiss that. That's a stupid thing to say. It means absolutely nothing. It doesn't fit any model, any objective empirical model when somebody says that. It means they have, most do not even have an idea of what the neural capacity or the storage capacity of the human brain is. it's so misunderstood. So that was something that somebody said a very long time ago, and it's a misstatement, and it sends the wrong message to people. You don't even use 10% of it. You're not even close to that. Not even close. So there's a lot written on it. There's a lot of peer-reviewed research that you can read, but just understand it'll go up and down. And you can get brain researchers at Berkeley that'll say one thing that is just insulting. Like, oh, we think you have 2 terabytes. What? Maybe you only have 2 terabytes, but I ascribe to this one over here that says, I'm off, I'm 50x or 500x that. Okay. So speak for yourself, Haas. But that's how they get with this stuff. Oh, well, we know. And they don't know. They have no idea. They're just speculating based on what they think the number of axioms and dendrites are, and the number of synapses that can be folded, but can be created. But it's all hooey. There's so much really good quality research that's been done on it that supports the whole notion that we really have no idea what our capacity is, but it is far greater than we can even imagine it, 10, 15, 20 years ago, right? So disregard that 10% thing. It's just BS.
So
go ahead.
Within the time traveler concept that Lexi's talking about, can we apply some of that in the sense of our ability to move between dimensions?
Well, yeah, of course. If you're omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent, you can do whatever you want to do with it, right? The only thing that you have to remember is that unless you have empirical evidence of what it is that you think you have done and seen and can bring back and objectify, then it's just experiential, right? Which doesn't discount it. It doesn't say don't do that. But if you can't objectify it and measure it quantifiably to establish an empirical evaluation of what you've done, where you say think you've been and what you think you have seen, meaning you've got to have some hard feedback for it, then you can't turn around and say that it was real. You can say it was real to you. You can say that it was experiential and it was eye-opening and it was spiritually uplifting, or it was a great journey and a fantastic, understanding of things that I didn't have before. But you have to be very careful about going past that. And that's the one thing that we don't do. We have so many people that just think, it's just, now I get to write a book and say that it's all real. It's all real to you, but you can't cast that expectation upon humanity and think, what was real to you, which you cannot prove, is now suddenly a dogma that you're going to teach and preach and demand of people. You just have to be careful with it. And people who are listening to it have to be very discerning, which is another quality that seems to be lacking within, the human population these days. They don't sit back and ask critical questions, about certain things. But yeah, of course, all those things they're experiential and you should do them, but just do them in the way I said you should do them. You can't, it's great to walk around like that and have that understanding. But back to Buck Charlson, Ely, and others. Edison used to go to sleep with holding two metal balls in his hand, about the size of golf balls. And the reason he held them in his hand is because he knew that this drifting into this theta brainwave state, right, to going into a nap, that was where he was now harvesting and collecting, at this omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent state. And when he would drift too far, the balls would fall out of his hands and he would wake up. And then he would be immediately like, okay, what do I remember? What was I searching for? What was there, right? He also mastered the idea of intention, which was, if you don't go into that state with a purpose, then anything can show up. You might come back with a new dog grooming brush, because why? Because your dog needed a bath and needed to groom it. Right. But if you're going to go in with a specific purpose, then that's when you will harvest from this collective unconscious, from this holographic matrix field. You theoretically, you'll harvest perhaps thoughts that have never been, codified and thought before within the human population.
That's
so, time traveler.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Time traveler. But you have to have an intention. And so even somebody who is, very much into meditation and astrology and tarot and astral projection, sometimes the word intention, I feel like it gets overused and it bothers me, or I'm just really impatient and I don't want to have an intention. I just want to go do it. But now I'm understanding what you're saying about going in, without an intent. You don't have a map, or you don't have a path to try to get where you're going.
Because let me relate another element to this story back to that again. So Harvard Dream researchers, some of them friends of mine, they're probably long gone out of the research now. This was like 30 years ago. Uh, we're trying to determine what dreams are and why they're there. And distilling it down, there are many variations of this, but distilling it down to the simplest idea that was brought forward is they're rehearsals. And so your brain is processing things and rehearsing events and scenarios. And if you do something like go into sleep with a purpose, with an intention, which I teach called thought incubation, if you want to incubate a specific purpose or a specific idea or potential, trying to find what you can harvest from this holographic matrix field while you're sleeping, then what will happen is your brain will now have purpose that is, cribbed up by your intention to remember what you perceive out there, to thoroughly study and investigate and research this. And so then your brain will look for that and work on that. If you just go to sleep every night with, oh, well, come what may, your brain will just move at the speed of thought through whatever Rolodex it thinks it needs to do, and whatever it thinks that you need to be working on in your subconscious, and pull that out. And that's why, you find yourself standing on a street corner in London naked, because it's just like going, okay, what would you do if that happened? Kind of a thing, right? So people have these very bizarre dreams, and they have those bizarre dreams, at least from the dream researcher perspective. It's just your brain doing what your brain does. It's a long, if I give you the longer explanation of that, it'll really slow us down. But they did this with rats, and they found that rats were constantly rehearsing the maze for either mating purposes or food. And that's what the rats were doing at night. And it was weird how they mapped it, but they mapped it. So they could get whatever the rat was dreaming, the frequencies and the brain signals were being matched to what the rat was seeing when they had a little camera on his head and he was running through the maze. And so they were getting the same signals, and the computer was then recreating the same imagery. Do you follow? And so they're like, he's running the maze. He's running the maze because there's a girl rat down there, and he's trying to figure out the best way to get through the maze right now, or to go get food or water, whatever the case may be. So that's what they mean with rehearsals. So you can let your brain run free, which I guess nothing wrong with that, or you can go into sleep, because every night you are going to descend from gamma, beta to alpha to theta to delta, right? And porpoise through the night. You might as well give it something to work on, because all of us have things to do. Now, the question is, how do you formulate a question? That's the tricky part. Okay. That requires a great deal of lecture and practicum, didactic and practicum, because most people, particularly today, in this day and age, think in chunks of things. Question that you might say, I'm going to drag this in tonight. I guarantee you there's 5 to 10 questions in that question that you're willing to drag in to explore that night. And if you do that, it's garbage in, garbage out. You go in with some nebulous, non-directional question, like, what should I do with my life? You're going to come back out on the other side of all that with nothing usable for you. So you have to learn how to think differently and think analytically and understand what that question is really asking, right? Because it is easily 10 other pieces in that question right there alone. 10 other pieces that have to be broken down. All of the, the mapping of where does that question actually go? What are all the sub pieces of that, topics? And then you have to decide, sometimes with help, is to decide what's the priority. In other words, to get to this final answer on this, which is the first sub question I need to ask? Which is the second, the third, the fourth, the fifth? Because if I jump around in it, then I might get one piece of something, but it'll color the other piece. You understand what I mean? You're trying to incrementally open this box into understanding precisely what it is that you're after. And here again, it's something that's governed by intention, meaning purpose. And when I talk about intention, the power of intention, I talk about it from two perspectives. It's all driven by choice, and it's the observer or the evaluator. Okay? You can be the observer or the evaluator. The evaluator, we all are on occasion, right? And the observer, we all are on occasion. And the idea is to strike balance in these two. And if you choose to stand heavier in one silo of purpose, make it the observer silo. Because the observer is a person that understands that there are no absolutes. There's always another version of everything. They're the person that never ultimately tries to be right all the time and expect everyone to agree with their version of everything. So it has all that. In fact, when I talked with Don Miguel Ruiz about this many years ago, he goes, the evaluator is living an inauthentic life. I thought, that's pretty harsh, but okay, I get it. And the observer is living an authentic life. But he goes, I like the fact that you've got, on each step of the ladder, because there are like 12 categories for each thing. And those are just quantifiable examples. There's probably 12,000, right, that go on in the human thought process. But I understand where he was going with it. Authentic life, inauthentic life. So we, through our own choices about how we're going to be with intention, it has to be, observer and evaluator, because we always have to measure things and look at things and pass some form of judgment, however slight or major, on something. So I understood that. And that's how I teach it. It's like, it doesn't have to be this overwhelming, overbearing thing. It's just a deciding of a purpose in your life as you're moving. I mean, there are times if you just want to go, hands off the handlebars and close your eyes and lean back. I get it. I mean, we've all done that. But, you get to be my age. Life is short. I don't need to take my hands off the handlebars. I want to be a firm, square damn grip on this thing. And I'm, living on purpose every day that I can live on purpose. And it's extraordinarily important to me. But I want to just add another thought of this. And I know you're like, will you shut up so I can ask another question? I just want to finish this thought, which is, I said to you that we think now in terms of like chunks of things. Right. We have, depending upon what your source is, we have over 500,000 words in our language, in the English language. More if you adopt some of the other stuff that's in there. It goes up like 750,000. But if you just go to, to several of the dictionaries and start looking at them, like the Oxford English Dictionary, it'll say like, 500,000 or 550,000 words, different words. That's a pretty extensive language. Do you know how many different words a day we use to communicate with our fellow human beings? Studies indicate less than 100 different words. So if you were to capture every word you're using, and then you started to when it repeated, you just put down the number of times you say and, but, maybe, don't know, right. And you start to see what that is. You can understand where I'm going with this. It's like, holy shit, right? 130 different words. And this is the thing that made my jaw drop. Studies of couples and how couples communicate. It is now less than 100 different words a day. Now, I know some people are going, well, yeah, that's good. They love each other. They've been together for a long time. They just kind of intuit people's stuff. Yeah, bullshit. They're just not communicating, which is why divorce rates are so high. It's why, the length of divorce is so short. It's because people don't take the time to master the language and understand what it means to communicate to someone, to look in their eyes. We recently went to dinner with somebody I care about. It was like it was it was like a year ago, and it was in a big restaurant, and it was Valentine's Day. So it came into Valentine's Day, and we talked to each other. I mean, we sat across the table, and we talked to each other. And a waitress came over and goes, I just am so grateful that you're doing this. Like, what? You're like, I prayed today when I came in that there would actually be a couple on Valentine's Day that would talk to each other. She goes, look around you. So we were looking around, and everybody in there on Valentine's Day, they have their heads down and they're typing and they're answering emails and texts. And
Wow.
they never even looked up. The menus come and they just grab the menu and slide it over. And then when they come for the order, they here's my order, throw the menu back, and they're back here again. So that was her point. Now, maybe that's an extreme example of it, but
maybe not.
It's not that extreme when you think about it. Sit around in an airport and look at what you look at. Sit around in a restaurant and look at what you look at. And what I've just described to you is what you're going to find the most of. So our human communication is getting shorter and shorter and less expressive. I find that in interviews, people get very impatient. I'll read it and I don't even look at the comments, but other people do for me. And they'll come back and go, yeah, they're pissed off because you didn't answer the question. I answered the question like 7 times in the process. I answered it 7 ways in the process of answering the question, but they don't want that. They want the answer in 3 sentences. That won't be me. So it won't be me. Because why? Because they think everything is Twitter and Instagram and something else and something else. And that's how they want. We've raised almost 2 generations now that's how they process human communication.
Right.
In
Which
social media.
Detailed enough. This is an interesting
It's an
conversation.
It's an abbreviated communications technique, and it's not healthy.
No.
It's not healthy.
Well, let's talk about communication with aliens. So, and has that happened with you?
No, but have I, as a remote viewer, seen alien life and alien civilizations and alien craft? Yes.
Yes.
But what does that mean? If you go back to what I was saying earlier, can I prove that? No. So that's why you haven't seen me turn around and write some book about something like that.
Right.
And say, here's my great experience and awareness of stuff. I mean, I'll talk about it occasionally, and so do my students. But, we've been doing stuff for Beyond Skinwalker Ranch. We've done
Oh, good.
3 shows now, Beyond the Skinwalker Ranch, with huge teams of remote viewers. First time was 70. Second time was 50. Third time was 50. Because, I apply what I teach. You never trust the results of a single remote viewer operating independently of other remote viewers. Why? Because rule number 1 says that remote viewing is not 100% accurate. Never has been, and it never will be. So you can't trust the results of one person going like, well, here's what happened, right? It's just foolish. It's not empirical. It's unscientific. It's not mathematically sound, statistically sound. It's just brio of saying, oh, I'm right all the time, or I'm a great remote viewer, and which is why you've never heard me say that, and I don't want any of my students to say it. So,
but if you collect the data, and it all sort of coalesces, right?
It correlates, right? And so when it correlates, that's what we're looking for. Then, I'll sit with a producer and look at the correlated data so that they can decide what they want to portray, because let's face it, it's entertainment, right? And they don't want things that they don't want on there. Like, that's like, no, that doesn't fit. So it doesn't work for us. It's not a category of something we want. So nothing is being created in order to meet that requirement. There's ample there. So they're just hacking and whittling it down so they can take what would be 3.5 hours like I did the first time, and then they whittle it down to like 90 seconds.
Right.
And then they found out, they're like, holy shit, these remote viewers they're giving us so much data. What do we know? It was actually Travis that turned around to them and went,
right.
Yeah. He says, why are you talking about this shit now? Why are you bringing this stuff up now that you've already done all the testing and all that stuff? He goes, why aren't you taking this stuff, all this data that was given to you, and why aren't you using that to decide what kinds of tests you're going to do and where you're going to do them? Made sense, right? which goes
Right.
to rule number 3 of remote viewing, is that it's not a standalone endeavor. It must always be used in consonance with some other investigative methodology, research methodology, intelligence collection methodology. It's never been intended to just be by itself, nor is any other intelligence collection methodology intended to be used by itself. That's why whenever they task for intelligence nowadays, it's called all source intelligence. They put it out to everybody. They pull it all back in and analyze it and look for correlation from all the different kinds of platforms that they have. So
This is fascinating.
yeah.
Lexi and I know one of the EPs for Skinwalker. So I'm curious that this data and this information hasn't been used to create something else, but maybe it has, and I'm just not aware of it.
Well, what do you mean by that? That was a pretty provocative question. What were you tossing out there, or a statement? What do you mean? How do you mean that?
Well, if there's several remote viewers and they're getting the same data, and that's sort of theoretically creating something that could possibly be there, then there is a way to objectify it through entertainment or documentary or whatever. There must be some secondary meaning to the data you've collected that could be further expanded upon, proved more.
I mean, here's what I thought, how I thought it would work, because I knew what it would be capable of doing. I get really frustrated at looking at these shows like, sorry, History Channel, I don't mean to say this about it, but like the Oak Island thing. I mean, I watched like the first few episodes of the first season and I was like, I'm done. Because, it was like, big cliffhanger, next week's we're gonna, this and the next end of the year, next season we're gonna rip the lid off of this and have all that, and it's just this constant like zzz, reeling people in zzz again, and I get crazy about that. It's like, why not some interpretive closure on there? And in reality, I'm being too harsh, because they do that. They're doing a lot of historical analysis and that kind of stuff, but there's never any explanations that, completely address an issue. So what I didn't want to see in Beyond Skinwalker Ranch, or even in Skinwalker Ranch, was this continue, you shoot rockets up and things explode where they're not supposed to explode. And everybody goes, well, geez, I don't know what that is. That's really weird. I've never seen that before. Drones go off the reservation and get rogue and go crazy. And gee, I've never seen that before. I knew that remote viewers could put some understanding or interpretation to that the scientists can't, because they're dealing with the technology to measure something, but they don't know what's behind it, right? What might be there. So the remote viewers, albeit not 100% accurate, but when you have 70 remote viewers, and out of the 70, like 62 or 51 are all describing something that correlates, that deserves to be brought to your viewing audience to say, well, here's what these folks who have been trained in this, here's what they do, and here's how they do it. So it's been presented, I think, by History Channel in an extraordinarily credible way. And, an astrophysicist like Travis and Eric, I mean, both of them, smart guys, have turned around and gone, this is great. This is really cool. So now we're, based on, we were limited in the first time we were doing it, because it's my fault. I didn't have, do you know what an embedded diagram is?
No.
An embedded diagram is when you're trying to take something from 4-dimensional perspective, right? You're trying to give it the 3 dimensions and plus the dimension of time. You're trying to illustrate that in some way. And then what happens is you're taking something that's 4-dimensional and now you squash it down onto a piece of paper. That's called an embedded diagram. They're very confusing to people looking at it. The person that understands what's portrayed in the embedded diagram, they get it, but everybody else goes, what the hell? Looking at it. And, we were taking 4-dimensional portrayals of points that were sensed by the remote viewers. meaning you get an X, Y, and a Z plane that you ask them to sense hotspots on that, right? Every viewer. So on the X plane, they sense using a map sensing technique, which they learn. They sense 4 points, and then those 4 points, each point as it's sensed there, using whatever method they choose, that has to then be written up into its color, into its verbal sensory data and visual sensory data to support why they perceived something there. They would not have perceived it if there wasn't something there. That is the intention going into it. So that creates pages of data for 1 point, and they do 4 points for just the A plane. Then they go to the Y, do the same thing. Then they go to the Z. So now you've got a half an inch of paper describing, those 12 points, and you have 12 points, 4 on the X, 4 on the Y, and 4 on the Z. Now, the way that works out is now those have to be plotted. Now, the first time, best I could do was an embedded diagram. Then went to a program where I was able to hack into this thing and actually plot like I wanted to on it. So we ended up being able to plot everything below ground, everything on the ground, on the surface, and everything above ground. And we did it in utilizing the Cartesian coordinate process, which was very laborious, because then you could then spin the model around. So you've got the target ranch underneath on the flat plane, but you can take your cursor and spin the whole model around, tip it up, tip it down, and they can then see these cones of travel, activity, of hits, right? Yeah. And so that then became, you could actually take it another step further, which we did in the last one we did, which was to give them a deflection and an elevation for where to fire the rockets based on the location on the ground, and then just applying the appropriate math to it and going, this is the deflection, meaning this way, on the compass, and this is the elevation. And that was, I don't know what the results of it were when they went out there to do that work. I just know, what correlates based on some of the stuff they've done, or, what they're seeing that the viewers are producing. But that's the kind of stuff that I knew remote viewing could do, that it could add to that program in that way. And it did. And I think that they're very happy with it. So
I'm sure.
I know it'll keep on coming, pretty sure.
How many cones of activity did you see in those areas? Or how many were you actually able to sort of show as a correlation multiple times?
Everything that 50 viewers sensed, in their 12 points. And so those were all plotted, which are a giant pain in the ass to do with, because they're,
so how many
Cartesian
plot
coordinates
points were there?
Well, I can't remember exactly, but, it's like 900 total. So it's a lot.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. And you start to get selective, like when you have what are called outliers that are outside the major clusters. You're looking for major clusters. Not everybody gets into the, some people might have a series of points that are outlined. They're clear off almost outside the reservation of what you're looking at. The grid square that you're looking at. And if that happens, you just leave that off. I mean, you put some outliers out there so people can see it. And there's probably about 5% that end up being outliers. So that gets removed. But if you go 70 people at, 12 points each, you can do the math and figure that out. It's significant.
Right.
And it creates a pretty amazing model for them to look at. And
so that's so
just
much
the plotted
activity.
points.
Yeah. There's an enormous amount of activity there.
And some of it's not extraterrestrial. Some of it's probably falls more into the category of paranormal.
Yeah, that's what we've heard. Still don't quite understand all that, but maybe it's, I don't know.
Well, extraterrestrial implies
worlds.
that you're talking about, you're talking about interstellar travel or, something like that. Things moving through portals from one portal to the other portal. And, paranormal implies that, it's evil. You know,
Potentially.
it's evil and poltergeist related, most of the time. And
Potentially.
so, well, it has been in those places, which is why those places stick out like sore thumbs
Right.
on the human spectrum, of places of interest. It's
Right.
not because they're, gloriously peaceful and loving and things are balanced and, rose garden's doing well and so are all the other wildflowers in the field and the deer come down and stand in the yard. These people are all talking about things they call white fuzzies or these black hairy things that are 3 feet tall that, that kind of stuff. It's like when you start, in the final analysis of it, you're looking at it, you're going, yeah, I get it now. I understand what we're looking at. So it's not,
Well, that there's
I'm
such a
not,
cluster of paranormal and extraterrestrial in those locations is really interesting. I don't necessarily think that the two go together, but what do I know?
I don't think
So,
they do personally.
okay,
I think
that's
there,
so interesting.
there's one that there's two of them that I got a very good sense of. There's just a lot of anomalous activity. The term they're coming up with now, high strangeness. That's the new buzz
That's
phrase
your
for
term.
for that. Not mine. That's not mine. I didn't come up with that. No, that's what I was told. They're like high strangeness. I was like, what's that? This kind of stuff and that kind of stuff. So that's what they now talk about. It's called high strangeness. And I'm like, yeah, okay. But no. And I've not found a mix of those things. I found, the last one that we did, much to the chagrin of, I think the producer, maybe not so much the director, but the producer very much he was like, geez, we're not a ghost show. You guys are talking about all this stuff and going,
but that's what's there.
I'm telling you, that's what the viewers came up with. Figure it out, I guess, because this is it. And yeah, but if you know those parts of those lands, there's millennia of war and death and blood. I mean, the ground's just soaked in blood in these places, and everybody thinks that so many of these indigenous peoples that they just sprung up out of the prairie, and grew like wildflowers. And hell no, man, they beat the shit out of everything. They conquered, they controlled, they warred against every other tribe that was lesser than them. They took them for food, for territory, for women, because they knew that they needed to thicken their gene pool. You can't have one tribal nation and have it just interbreeding for the next 600 years, because then you stop having warriors. You start having problems, right? Mm-hmm. So they knew that they had to go find females from other tribes and take them. So kill all the men unless they turn them into slaves, and take maybe the young boys if they could train them to become part of their tribe. The women were prized possessions as much as horses and food and anything else they needed to get to stay alive and to dominate that particular place. So in the Dakotas, they're unearthing mass graves that are hundreds of years old, long before the white man got there, that are filled with men, women, and children of indigenous tribes that have been slaughtered by another indigenous tribe. So I don't know what everybody thought the white man was supposed to do when they came across the Appalachians. Like we were supposed to go like, oh, sorry, got to go back. This place is taken. No, we just became the next dominant tribe. Step in and go like, yeah, you're leaving, or you can work with us, but you want to fight us? We have cannons. You don't. We have other kinds of things, and you don't. So that's how it boiled down for me. But looking at that was, wow. I just never looked at it in that way. Mm-hmm. And I didn't even then. I was just looking at what the viewers produced, and it was it was unnerving to see and sense just the horror of what was there.
So could we, David, just conceptually speaking, could we, with a group of remote viewers, could we put together something that would prove or disprove extraterrestrial activity on the planet, or in a particular location, or at a particular time, that kind of thing?
Well, yeah, of course you can. But again, it goes, remember what I keep going back to. You don't have any feedback. You have no provable evidence of it. Despite everything you hear, it's like aliens, people talking about, aliens are out there and why don't we know about them and why doesn't the government tell us? It's like, okay, look, if it was really that prevalent, and if alien life form really wanted to interface with humankind, they'd freaking land a spaceship on the damn White House lawn and go up and knock on the front door. I mean, it would kind of that simple, right? But since that's not happening, then you have to conclude that maybe that's not their intention and it's not their desire. If we're going to just say that they are there, which I believe they are, but not in the numbers that you think they are. The vast majority of what you're seeing, and I think a conservative estimate is to say somewhere in the neighborhood of like 92 to 96% of these sightings are actually sightings that come from the space war. Which people have no idea. They just don't even think about that. I mean, that started in December of 1945, a 50-year plan set aside saying the next dimension of war is going to be in space. And those who get there firstest with the mostest are going to be the most secure in the doing of that. And that's exactly what we did. We were in a space war with the Soviet Union in 1945. They did not lose a step. So you can say things like lifting body aircraft, which I know you don't know what that means, but it simply means that they don't have wings and they don't have normal control surfaces. Okay. They look completely different from an airplane, but lifting body aircraft or craft were being test flown in 1967, 66, 67, 68 at, out there in the West at Edwards Air Force Base. They were being flown. There have been exotic propulsion devices that have been in the study and in the work of things now for 70 years, right? 80 years now that's out there that they've been looking at this stuff. There are open patents that are on, you can go to US Patent Office and look at electromagnetic propulsion devices and other kinds of things. Now, hear me. If you see it in the clear, on the US Patent Office, it means that it's now gray or completely defunct. But still, you can see that it means that somebody has been looking at that and working on it. And the ratio that everyone that knows these things will accept is that for every gray project or dead project, there's 10 black projects that are exactly similar, just in different variants that are still being worked on and studied and researched and developed. And because why? Because we have been in a war, we are still in a war, and we are very concerned about war moving into space. This Space Force thing, that was actually talked about in Reagan's time with the Strategic Defense Initiative and all those kinds of things. We were just coming up with that crap because of the Cold War. We were coming up with that crap because it was a real war. And we were in the 1960s, we were shooting Soviet satellites down with anti-sat missiles. And then we would turn around and go, oh, it was just an old communications satellite of our own. No, it wasn't. We actually you had a Soviet satellite that was flying over, overlooking at things we didn't want it to look at. And they strapped an anti-sat missile onto a Navy aircraft and trained a pilot to use it. He flies up, and when they tell him to release it, he did. And it shoots up into space, and it finds that satellite, fix, and kills it, blows it right out of the atmosphere, right? Or, well, it was above the atmosphere, but you get me. So this is real stuff. And it's very concerning that it's there, because the Chinese are now full on board with it, working with the Russians to do it. The Russians and the Chinese are sharing technology and other things. Now, does that displace the UAP, UFO? Well, no. It just means that the percentage of that might truly be alien, meaning, from another place, another planet, another life form, is diminished considerably. I know we can't share a screen, but I have a graphic that actually shows the number of UFO sightings that starts at starts at 1900 and it just goes forward. And I know people turn around and go, yeah, well, there's evidence of it. Yeah. So if you understand that the space war begins in 45,
Right.
and you look at that portrayal, when does it start showing up in the United States? 1945, 46, 47, 48. It just gets thicker and thicker. Every year that goes by, it gets thicker and thicker and thicker. And why? Because it's not just us. It's it's the people that we perceive as our enemy who are doing that as well. So you've got all these different things that are out there that people happen to see. You have craft that have reentry speeds and into the atmosphere of 23,000 miles per hour. You have craft at 18,000 miles per hour, and they don't typically bring that stuff down at a time where you can really see it. Occasionally that's happened, but usually if you can ever see it, or if some Navy pilot can see it, or Air Force pilot can see it, it's because it's a gray project. It's when they're getting ready to kick to the curb. So you may see some of the flights where it comes down out of the atmosphere, out of space, comes into the atmosphere, and it drops. They try to drop them straight down into the classified bases where they're trying to hide them. They tried to get them out of sight.
Yeah, it was interesting. I know in San Diego last night there were some sightings of something re-entering the atmosphere that was, wingless, and it looked as though it had a lot of propulsion behind it, and then it sort of disappeared, like it sort of entered and then disappeared. So, and San Diego, right? So I'm assuming they were just trying to get rid of it or land it or whatever. And maybe it was ours and maybe it wasn't. I don't know.
That's why I say 92, 96%. And I think that's conservative. I think that the amount of time that you're actually seeing something from off world or otherworldly is probably 2 to 3%.
Fascinating.
The rest of it, folks, is weaponry, craft and weaponry. You have no idea the things they're talking about doing. I mean, we already had space stations with U.S. Air Force astronauts, not U.S. Air Force astronauts working for NASA, U.S. Air Force astronauts, because they had Air Force platforms up there. And they are going to keep doing that and keep building them. And they won't be like the International Space Station. Oh, no. They're going to be far different than that. And their plans are to go ahead and put things up there that, they can store heavy weapons and ammunition, rations, medical supplies. There are even discussions about putting those kinds of stations up there and putting special ops teams, rotating them up there. Why? Because when you're up there and the Earth is spinning the thousands of miles per hour underneath you as it is, you can deploy a combat team somewhere in the world in 15 to 30 minutes, anywhere in the world from that place, from that platform, and drop the logistics package right in with them as they go to sustain them there. And we don't have that capability right now. You send somebody by C-17, you've got to deploy them into friendly ground somewhere and then rotary wing them somewhere else. And that takes a week or more. You send them by ship, that's weeks to deploy combat forces somewhere. And I know that you guys I know you don't think that way. And I love you for that you don't have to think that way. Yeah, I love you for that.
You mean because we're naive or?
No, you're not naive. You're just, you don't have to fill your head with that kind of stuff, but other people do. So.
Right. It's interesting. It's fascinating, though. And it sort of brings things full circle for me, frankly. So, and it makes a lot of sense. It's interesting, too, with Bezos and Tesla, putting up so many satellites. So, or Elon Musk, rather, I should say, with the
76,000.
Yeah, that's a lot of satellites. So obviously it's not so we can necessarily communicate better. I'm sure there's something else going on. So it's just interesting.
He's not doing it so he can sell internet service.
No.
If any of us thought that would be a little naive. There's no reason. He's not doing it to sell internet. Starlink is, nope, not happening. I mean, it's there, but that's not the purpose. So
right.
And there's a UK
his own space war.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure he's being supplemented. He's not, he's.
Oh, of course. He's not doing it himself.
There's a UK satellite going to put the exact same thing up.
Where's the space? We're going to run out of room.
Well, astronomers are already now really bitching about this because they have fixed locations and they're looking up they're looking up from fixed platforms. And what happens is, as the Earth spins, it goes around. Either these things are geosynchronous or sometimes they're not, and it doesn't matter, whatever it is. They have these photographs now of space, and they trying to track a star, and what they have are these big white freaking light slashes that go across it, which are from these satellites that are up there all over the place now.
Right.
And of course, the government's take on that is, yeah, well, why do you think we put these satellites that are, put these satellites that have telescopes on them, like the Hubble and others? That's why we put that out there, so we can see with that stuff and not just rely on all this stuff. So you're just going to pick and choose your windows for when you're going to see stuff. I heard some guy go, well, Saturday afternoon at 1 is probably not a good time for me to look into space. That'd be a right statement.
It's interesting.
It is crazy.
Seriously, it's crazy. I've done some star watching with an engineer from Rocketdyne, actually. In space, there were so many satellites that night, just in trying to do some photography, some space photography. It's impossible because it was so cluttered. It was so there's so much satellite pollution. But I mean, it was interesting when we took the moment to really look at it. It's like, well, I don't know where the falling stars are, but I'm certainly seeing about 100 satellites.
It's so disappointing.
Wait till he looks up there and he sees a giant floating logistics base, going around a giant, a combat warehouse flying by in the sky, has tanks in it and everything else. So yeah, it's going to get.
But even in a place like New Mexico, where I'm from, we were out there this summer with my dad and his telescope, and he lives in a kind of rural area. There's almost no light pollution. And I was so excited because I was seeing shooting stars. And then a couple more people looked, they're like, no, those were satellites. And I was so disappointed because I was in nature.
Killing
and I
romance.
I saw these like 2 shooting stars moving like in tandem, and it was so beautiful. And my dad's like, nope. Congratulations, you saw satellites. So different.
I'm not laughing at you with the situation. I'm just like, geez, yeah, I agree. It's like ridiculous, and it's only going to get worse. It's going to get worse, and that's an unfortunate thing. But we are in a very bizarre world right now. When we are, the fastest growing industry on the planet is human trafficking. Depending on where you look at it, it's $300 to $350 billion a year now in trafficking human beings. Forced labor, sex traffic, pedophilia, all that stuff. I mean, it's the largest industry. And our country happens to be the largest consumer of all 3 of those.
Well, we are the largest consumers, period. So it would make sense that, or it doesn't make sense, but it's disgusting.
Yeah, we had a guest on, Diana, the director Lee Whitaker in his movie.
Right.
He had a movie about human trafficking, which is really interesting.
Sounds of Freedom, that one?
No, not Jim's and Angel Studios movie, but another movie that was more of another kind of depiction.
It was cool. It was an ass-kicking veteran. Yeah, she was Amy the Vigilante.
Oh, yeah. I'm aware of that one. Yeah, you can look at the statistics that come from the United Nations, which very carefully masks it and minimizes it. And they do so because, they could really be seen as, kind of the caretakers of this. And, the organization that should be most in protest of it, but are not, and they're not very vocal of it. And then you've got, the Department of Homeland Security, you have the State Department, and you have some other agencies, FBI and others. So the figures dance around a lot. I mean, there's, they claim now that there are more forced labor human slaves than there have ever been in, just the recorded history of humanity. That's significant. I mean, it's like, 12 million slaves came off of the Ivory Coast during the slave trades, where Dutch, Portuguese, Spanish were bringing them into the West Indies, and then 3 were delivered into the southern United States. Out of those 12,700,000, I think they're I don't know I can't remember the exact figure of loss of life, that they died of disease or something else, but it was in the millions, according to the slavers' logs, right? Which were considered accurate.
Mm-hmm.
But now the U.S. is admitting, well, like Department of State will admit to 27.6 million slaves. And there are other figures that push it upwards of 65 million slaves. That's unbelievable. That is the entire population of California and Texas.
Mm-hmm.
That's how many slaves there are. Not in the United States, but globally.
Worldwide. Right.
But it's really
Staggering
unnerving
numbers.
and disconcerting, the evil that is gripping humankind right now.
So speaking of humankind, will you be teaching soon? Are there any upcoming workshops? I know some of our listeners are really interested potentially in being part of remote viewing and would like to learn more. I've had a couple of people contact me directly about it. So I'm just curious if you have something coming up on the schedule where you're available to share some of your incredible knowledge with people.
Thank you for that. Yes. You can go to David Morehouse. Don't go to the .com website. I don't have any ownership of that, and I don't endorse what's there. davidmorehouse.org. And you can see the courses and that kind of stuff there and other things. And pardon me, we have not started filling out the calendar, but we are really trying to get ready to do that. I mean, working with William at Upgrade, they've already put down a whole slew of courses. And when you just understand it's like a 6-day course, it gets, the calendar fills up quick. But yes, we are going to start doing that.
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Very exciting. Yeah. davidmorehouse.org. That's brand new for this year. Is that right?
It is. Yeah. I think that it was just published like 3 weeks ago, maybe 4. Yeah.
Awesome. Very exciting.
Yeah.
We'll be sure to mention that.
Yeah.
And see if
I can't look at it because every time I look at it, I find a typo. So I have to be really careful. I drive myself crazy and the people who are doing it. So, yeah.
So Lexi, I know we've got to kind of wrap up here. Are we hitting all the points that we wanted to hit for this conversation today?
Absolutely.
It's up to you, ladies.
Oh my gosh, absolutely. I mean, I wrote down something you said earlier about rats dreaming the maze. And I know you were talking about an experiment or a study, but I just sort of was thinking about that for the past, 45 minutes. And I was thinking, well, aren't we all rats dreaming the maze until we wake up and maybe recognize our full potential as human beings? But then I thought, isn't part of life supposed to be being in a state of being a rat dreaming the maze, so that when we do awaken, it's that more beautiful? I don't know if there's in Greek mythology, there's the river, I don't know how to pronounce it, Leaf. It's the river of forgetfulness. So that souls, before they come down to earth, they go through this river of forgetfulness and they forget their divine origins. So part of the fun of life and incarnating on earth is to remember. So that's where my brain's been. I've been listening to you, David, but rats dreaming the maze, I thought that was gorgeous. And I think it should be the title of your next book.
It's funny. Well, I'm glad it inspired rat think in you. And
I can't stop. I hope you write it.
I think that where we need to be working is look, I'm getting into the twilight of my life. So all I can do is empower people that the best that I can for the years that I have left, decades I have left in this life. But people have got to start taking, what is taught and these wisdoms about the fact that we are born into this life with these gifts and that we have not used them. We were given them for a purpose, for a reason, and we have not yet discovered what that is. And we have to figure out, where are you going to, like in fission theory, where are you going to introduce a significant amount of the population, which would have to be 10% in that theory, to reach a critical mass and begin a chain reaction of ideology, right? The right ideology, thinking about the right things to transform humanity. And that's going to start with children. And it has to start with children, teaching them the right things and empowering them to understand that this is a gift that they came into this life with. If you read enough of the research that's been done by pediatric psychiatrists and psychologists, most of it through Scandinavian things, where they were asking kids, young children come into this life with an awareness of where they came from, and they have an awareness of their purpose, and they have an awareness of what they're supposed to be doing here. And then we, quite frankly, literally just take it out of them, you know, peer pressure, academic pressure, parental pressure, you name it. And we just beat this understanding out of them and make them focus on other things. And if we were to take a generation and then another generation, theoretically, if you're looking at the numbers, it would take 3 generations. 3 generations of children growing up, being nurtured and empowered to understand these gifts that they have been given. Now, that's a dream. That's a vision, right? It's a very real, doable thing. But all I can do is teach adults. I can teach them what I know, but they have to go forward and do something with it. And they ask me all the time, like, at the upgrade thing, you know, there are these people that are multi-millionaires. Like some of the people that work with him pay him $2.2 million a month for personal counseling. And I know it's unbelievable, right? You're just kind of like, seriously? I mean, really? But yeah. So, but they turn around to me and go like, okay, well, what am I going to do with this? After I learned this from you, what am I going to do with this? And I sometimes find myself just wondering, why does that question always get asked? I mean, if somebody told me that I was omnipotent, omniscient, omnipresent, and eternal, and that I could know that rather than just believe it or hope it or wish it, I wouldn't have to ask the question about what would I do with this. I'd be using it in every possible imaginable way. But I just met some really good folks there. You know, we talked about children and we talked about, you know, these kinds of things need to happen. There needs to be that kind of focus, not mindfulness training. There needs to be, you know, this kind of training, not mindful, this kind of thing, something concrete that they can walk through life with, not, you know, mindfulness getting along. You know, that part will come if you give them this other, right?
Right.
There may be some rogues in that. There always will be, right? But if you're going to transform humanity, if you're going to make a difference, that's where you make it. Human beings need to be focusing on the important things now. ETs and UFOs and all that shit, that's not important. It's not important. If it were important, if it were really important, like I said, they would show up and go like, hey, we're here. You know, what do you need? And they're not. I think that they're flying by at, you know, at light portal speed, and they're looking down with the kids in the back and they're going, aren't you glad you don't live there? You know, as they speed off through the next event horizon, you know, in their interstellar travels. So stop worrying about that stuff. Stop running around pouring gasoline on yourself to self-immolate, because every time somebody shows up with some idea about it and says this or says that, it's like, geez, just, I mean, even if you, like in A Course in Miracles, there's an interpretation in the Course of Miracles that says you are in conflict because you can't understand that it's you just applying this conflict. The issue is, what would you do with it? I mean, if somebody finally turned around you, which they're not, and said, okay, here's 2 dead alien bodies and here's a broken up spacecraft that we pulled out of the desert, you know, 70 years ago. Now, what would then be? What would everybody be doing? How would that change humanity? How would that empower humanity? What would that do? You could then turn around and go like, oh, see, I knew there was. That's never going to happen. Nobody's going to do that. because they don't have to. There is no legal precedent that says that they have to. As I explained to you guys, that the President of the United States doesn't have that ability to do that. That would take a Supreme Court decision that they were going to step into some special access program and they were going to reveal something that, by their definition, the intelligence community places the United States at risk, endangers their national security. Why? Because we're in a space war. You think you're going to make them turn around and expose some aspect of what might be part of that space war, or something that they have that they're utilizing as part of that space war? It's not public. It's not public information. You don't get to do that. And it's never going to happen. So all of this stuff is just posturing, and it's misdirecting energies that could be put toward many other more productive things, like human transformation.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing's going to come here and save us from ourselves. It's going to be our job to do that. And we all have the intellect. Look at you two beautiful ladies, right? You know what you're doing in your audience and everything else. Use that. And I know you are. Inspire, make a difference. You know, I'm just an old soldier here trying to tell people that in September, I'll be 70 years old. I have seen some shit in 70 years, believe me. And I am so unimpressed with the fact that these people, entire population of people running around, constantly pissed off at everything because somebody doesn't drag a dead alien out and go, well, see here, kind of small, but here. It's just not going to happen. It's just preposterous to even think that you're entitled to that kind of information, if it even exists. One guy who I trust in my life has told me that. Ron Blackburn, PhD. I don't even know if he's still alive. One of my students, I met him at the Abiquiu Inn, my first time I ever met him. He was sitting with Jacques Vallée, which I think French-Canadian author of space aliens and stuff. And I'm sitting there with him, and this is literally like 10 years later. And he says to me, comes right up to me in the middle of a class, and he goes, I've seen an alien. He goes, we have them. And I touched them. It's at Lawrence Livermore.
Mm-hmm.
And so now he is a physicist who worked at Lawrence Livermore Air Force Base. I have absolutely no reason to doubt him at all. And he just never was the kind of man to me that would have stepped up and bullshitted me with something like that. But my response was, okay, well, let's see what you got for your target, that kind of thing. Because it doesn't do me any good to hear that. I'm not going to see it. So I just have to take your word. And I'm not going to, of course, I just did tell you guys that he said that, but you understand where I'm going with it.
Right. What do we do with that? And what difference does it necessarily make in your daily existence? Mm-hmm.
Right. Exactly. Are we changing the world with that information? No. Are we trying to do something to better the world for the next generation and the next and the next based on that? No. So when you hear it, it doesn't really do anything for you, does it?
Mm-hmm. It's interesting.
It's kind of flat, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it is interesting.
But
Maybe not flat. Yeah. I mean, if like Diana, it's when we say jokingly or not jokingly, hey, what if we were aliens? And people say, sure, whatever. Okay. Like, all right, great. Like, what's going on with this meeting or this production company or this show or this project? Next. People are not interested in just regular looking aliens if they do exist, right? It would just be so boring. So that's sort of my theory. If they are here, they're just like regular. And so one day saying, I'm from Lyra will be like saying, I'm from Nebraska. And people say, that's fantastic. What are you doing that's so advanced? I have 3 cats and a job at Home Depot. I mean, they're just going to be like everyday people.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
They may already be here. Who knows?
They may already be here. I was going to say, did I get silence from David? Oh God, what did I just do?
Not at all.
What a conversation.
Yeah. It's a good one.
It's a good one. It's a very good conversation. I really appreciate the last words that you said, David, seriously. So, and you as well, Lexi. I think both of you are right.
Both of you. Yeah, both of you guys.
Well, you guys are
amazing.
Pleasure
to be with you.
Thank you, David, for coming back, and we hope you come back again and again.
Of course. Anytime you ask me, I'll be here.
Okay. Hope to see you soon. Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Soul Fam podcast. Be sure to tune in to every episode where we dive into a different rabbit hole of the known and unknown to empower you in conscious living and exploration of the greater universe. We hope you leave each episode with a little stardust in your hair and inspiration in your heart. With love from your Soul Fam.